Hello and welcome to the TEDx Gateway webinar series. The world has changed. TEDx Gateway is India's largest ideas platform and one of the largest in Asia. This digital series was created with an endeavor to bring together experts, visionaries, and thought leaders across different fields to your home and to create conversations in these uncertain times. So I'm Govindraj Ethiraj, a journalist and focused a lot of late, like many journalists are, on the health sector. So what are we doing today? So as you know, a coronavirus vaccine is around the corner or maybe already with us. Some 47 vaccines are in between phase 1 testing for safety and phase 3, which is more large-scale efficacy tests. Three vaccines are already approved for limited use. So as we move closer to what is the only foreseeable near-term solution to the pandemic, or many people so believe, here are some questions we must pose. First, what are the risks when it comes to these vaccines and when it comes to administering or getting these vaccines administered to us wherever you are in the world? Second, are there risks that we know about but we're not talking about, or not talking about suitably or sufficiently? Third, how do countries prepare for vaccines and vaccine delivery, distribution, and administration, and what are the challenges there? And finally, what is the implication of all of this on other vaccine preventable diseases? And that's an important question that we should be asking. Remember, countries like India have a lot of other challenges as well, which in some ways have got suppressed at a time of, in the times of COVID, particularly in the last 4 or 5 months. So to discuss and throw light on all of this, I'm pleased and delighted to be joined by Dr. Saad B Omer. Dr. Saad is the director of the Yale Institute of Global Health and a professor of medicine and epidemiology at Yale University Schools of Medicine and Public Health. Dr. Saad has conducted studies in the past in the United States, Guatemala, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and South Africa. Dr. Omer's research portfolio includes clinical trials to estimate efficacy and safety of maternal and or infant influenza, pertussis, polio, measles, and pneumococcal vaccines, and trials to evaluate drug regimens to reduce mother-to-child transmission of HIV. He has published over 300 papers in peer-reviewed journals and has mentored over 100 junior faculty, clinical and research postdoctoral fellows and PhD and other graduate students. Dr. Saad Omer has a PhD in global disease epidemiology and control program from the Department of International Health at the Johns Hopkins University. He also has a master's in public health from the Johns Hopkins University. He served on many panels, including the US National Vaccine Advisory Committee and the WHO Expert Advisory Group for healthcare worker vaccination. On that note, it's my pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Saad, and it's over to you.
It's my pleasure to be here. And as we know that this is a life-changing, once-in-a-generation event that is happening all around us. This is an event that is impacting economies, individuals, families, companies, and so on and so forth. And the most sustainable way out of this problem is vaccination. And therefore, a lot of efforts have been made to bring a vaccine to the public, to the market, and to then mass vaccinate people. And whenever you have that kind of an effort that is global in nature and broad in impact, you not only use it to impact the problem you're trying to address, but you also change the very field, the very tools that you are trying to bring to bear into this kind of a problem, meaning that we are undoubtedly having an impact on the vaccine field itself. So therefore, I'll be talking about vaccines in the context of COVID-19. And the specific topic that I'll be focusing on is evolution of a resilient vaccine system amidst COVID-19. So before I go on, what are vaccines? So we know that there are certain products that we use, certain tools we use to produce immunity. The more formal definition is that it is a preparation of killed microorganisms, living or attenuated, meaning you diminish their disease potential, organisms, or living fully virulent organisms that are administered to produce or artificially increase immunity to a particular disease. Essentially, these are substances we use to enhance our own immunity and induce memory. And that's a specific term that we use in immunology, that it induces memory through vaccination in anticipation of an actual infection so that you are protected in advance. So there are several types of vaccines. I'm not going to go through that a lot in detail, but this is a schematic. So you take this pathogen, you attenuate it, meaning that you decrease the disease potential but keep it alive. It's called the attenuated vaccine. You take the pathogen, you mix it in a cell culture, for example, with another strain, and then the offspring of that mixing is called reassortant vaccine. It has the desirable characteristics, meaning it doesn't cause disease but invokes immunity. You inactivate it or kill it, and it's called, you use a killed organism as your vaccine. It's called the killed vaccine. You inactivate the vaccine, you chop it up, you purify, and only use a few subunits. It's called the subunit vaccine. And if you, in certain cases, for certain bacteria, it's not relevant here, you take a sugar molecule from the bacterium and then connect it to a protein. It's called a protein polysaccharide conjugate vaccine. So a lot of the other examples are relevant to COVID-19. This one isn't, because this is more specific to bacteria. But then you take these vaccines, you take the organism, extract the DNA, insert it in a bacterium, etc. So program this with this DNA that you have extracted from the pathogen, and then that pathogen, this vector, produces an antigen, a protein that you purify and make a recombinant subunit vaccine. Or so you just take the DNA itself. It's called the naked DNA vaccine. Or you insert DNA into a vector. And take the whole thing as a recombinant vectored vaccine. And then you take the DNA and then you do in vitro translation. So in the lab, you translate into what we call messenger RNA that our body uses to send messages to various parts of the immune system and other systems. And that formulation of encoded mRNA or messenger RNA is also used as vaccines. So this is from a pathogen that has DNA. If COVID-19 has RNA, so there are a couple of additional steps involved. But essentially what you do is that you start with a pathogen and then go through sort of different steps, and different kinds of vaccines are then produced. A lot of them, because it's a new COVID-19 is a new pathogen, it's a new virus that we have encountered as humans. Therefore, we are having the immunization program is using a lot of these techniques: attenuation, reassortment, subunit recombinant vaccines, and so on and so forth, and then the messenger RNA vaccines as well. So I thought I'd give you an overview. As was mentioned, that there has been substantial progress. According to the last estimate of one of the entities that is keeping track of it, there's more than 300 quote-unquote immunization programs out there. But remember, let's exercise some caution about what that number means. What essentially that number means is that someone has thought of a systematic strategy and announced it. The more serious ones are in a little over 140 or something. But even within that, a lot of them at the lab stage, or we call the preclinical stage. 24 are in phase 1 for testing safety and dosage, 14 are in phase 2, 9 in phase 3, 3 are limited approval. So I'd be happy to answer questions what that means. If there is even limited approval, why are we not using it, let's say in places like India and the US? But the most important number here is that there are 9 vaccines in the so-called phase 3 trial, in which we look at the vaccine efficacy. So the actual impact on the virus itself, or the disease produced by the virus, not just lab biomarkers or not just biomarkers of response, but actual protection against this virus. So these are phase 3 trials. And in these trials, the sample size, the number of people enrolled is pretty substantial. And approximately 30,000, for example, in a few trials in the US, people are enrolled, and so on and so forth. And those tests are going on. So that's the stage after which you actually get approval, proper approval, and you start usually traditionally vaccinating people if things go well in this stage. Just to give you an overview of what happens in a traditional vaccine development plan, if you identify a pathogen, it's not a pandemic pathogen, you start with, create a small scale clinical trial material. And right before that, you identify the target that you're going to attack with your vaccine, and you have a go, no go decision. And then you do preclinical or lab-based experiments before you go into phase 1 trials, which are first in human trials. And then you get into phase 2 and 3, efficacy, etc. Trials, and then you get to licensure. As this is happening, you're slowly scaling up manufacturing, but until there is licensure, you only scale up for large-scale testing. You don't scale up for vaccinating the world, because most vaccines that go into a pipeline for phase 1 onwards actually do not make it to licensure, because they show limited efficacy, for example, in the clinical testing. So therefore, you don't invest in that traditionally. And then once the licensure is there, there is large-scale manufacturing that happens. Then you have a pandemic paradigm under which we are developing vaccines right now. Or what we have done is essentially taking the steps, we meaning the global vaccine community, is that we have taken those steps and compressed them. So we haven't bypassed any steps, but found efficiencies in the processes by overlapping some of these steps. And in that, targets were identified very quickly. And there have been selection by various entities that are responsible for developing vaccines of partners to develop these vaccines. And we've had clinical development very often. Phase 1 and 2 trials, or in a couple of cases, 2 and 3 trials, have been compressed. And you have efficacy trials, and then the regulatory pathway are likely to be fast, where there is a possibility, even with mainstream data, that you may have what's called emergency use authorization of the vaccines, and I'd be happy to answer questions in detail. But then what the other innovation that has happened is that manufacturers have decided on their own or with investments from governments and philanthropic entities like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that the risk is so high of letting people die by scaling up manufacturing after licensure, that it is worth investing in manufacturing as trials are being done. And so the idea is that not to release any doses, not to vaccinate people before a vaccine is approved, but the idea is to have some doses ready, have the manufacturing capacity ready, so that as soon as the vaccine is licensed or authorized otherwise, you can start vaccinating people. And then there was this idea, how we do that. There was this idea that we should have this paradigm to develop vaccines in a faster manner. And this came around 2015 by a few vaccine luminaries, scientists such as Stanley Plotkin, Adil Mahmood, who used to be with the vaccine company. He's actually passed away since then. And then Jeremy Farrar, the person who leads Wellcome Trust. And the idea was to look at these innovative pathways. And since, just as an example, I would say that this sped up paradigm is going to continue. So this is one way our system has evolved. The next time we do any vaccine, some elements of this efficient paradigm are likely to survive. The other thing that has happened is that this call for establishing a global vaccine development fund in public health emergencies was heard. And a few years ago, this organization called CEPI, so Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, was established. And this organization, or CEPI, very quickly, so remember this idea came in 2015, that was articulated. And in a short span of 5 years, we've had this pandemic where this entity called CEPI at the global level is already investing, was the first entity that invested in vaccine development for global use for low and middle income countries and high income countries as well. And their model is that they will be the ones who would do early investments, even between pandemics, but in this case, right after the start of pandemic, in products, so that the idea is that even if one of them is successful, the process is de-risked. And going forward, this entity will play an important role because of what they have done so far. And then combined with this facility, they are investing in 9 vaccines so far. The US government is investing in another, their separate vaccine development program, and other countries like China, etc., have their internal program as well. But the global mainstay is this entity called COVAX, where CEPI, WHO, and there's another entity called Gavi, and I'll come to that in a second, are coming together to say, look, we need 2 billion doses to be delivered by this COVAX facility or COVAX entity that I mentioned. And it should be a globally fair distribution of vaccines as soon as they're available. And in order to do that, there needs to be investment in a diverse, actively managed portfolio of vaccines so that one of them is successful at least. And then to create this COVAX, this facility where countries can, high-income countries can pay into it to de-risk their development, and low and middle-income countries can also participate and reap the benefits of this being available. So it's based on your need, your ability to pay. These are the candidates, COVID-19 vaccine that CEPI is backing. There are mRNA platforms. There are old school live attenuated platforms that I mentioned, recombinant protein platforms, and then vector-based platforms like the ones that Oxford is doing, like the one Serum Institute of India has said that they have are investing in producing them doses before licensure, so that as soon as, or if there is licensure granted, there is this quick scale up of vaccine delivery. So there's a diverse portfolio that increases chance of success. Then Gavi, Global Alliance of Vaccine Immunization, that was its former full name, is responding to this. Traditionally, they have focused on deploying, after a vaccine is developed, they are the ones that deploy vaccines in several countries, not in all countries, through investments, etc., and again, working with technical partners. And so far, their focus has been on childhood vaccines or teenage vaccines. But now, for the first time, they're going into a situation where a lot of people will be adults that would be including in vaccination. And so this is one focus. I was part of this group for the US National Academies of Science. The idea is to vaccinate, we were asked to create a tiered model of who gets vaccine in the first, second, third phase, third or fourth phase. This is for the US, just to clarify. Each country will do their own prioritization, but just to give you an example, a lot of the groups covered in early phases, like healthcare workers, first responders, people of other ages that live in nursing homes, etc., and other have diseases that put them in high risk, will be in the first few phases. Children do not get to be a priority until phase 3, based on the dynamics of this disease. So the message here is, whatever the composition of the groups in each country, it will be an adult-focused vaccination program. And so countries need to prepare for an adult vaccination program. And so going forward, even after this pandemic, the idea is that we will have even stronger vaccination portfolios that are adult-focused. But before that, we have never done adult vaccination at these levels. So the challenge in the short term is to do this quickly and effectively. But on the other hand, the challenge is also met by the opportunity that at the end of the process, we will come out with a stronger adult immunization program.
Let me just pick up quickly on the last point that you made. So you said that this is the first time that we are doing an adult vaccination. So which means that all our vaccine efforts, which I guess is logical as well as someone who's been through it, is something that happens to us as children.
Yeah, so there are adult vaccines already there. Certain countries do that, but not at that level. So often countries do it in healthcare workers, some pregnant women. So influenza is the most common one. There's the vaccine recommended for the elderly, and various countries do it in private sector, etc. But a mass vaccination that covers so many adults is unprecedented, especially in recent history. We did that as a world in the smallpox eradication program, but it was very targeted, where you would control outbreaks by looking at people who got the virus and then creating a ring of protection around them. But mass vaccination for adults at this level is unprecedented.
Right. So is there something to, for instance, like the potency of vaccines for children being lower, and which is what we've created in the past, to the potency of the vaccines now, which are more aimed at adults, being higher or stronger? And is there any trade-off or anything to worry about on that particular count?
So that's an interesting question. So what happens is that the vaccines that are used in children and created for children, the potency and the effectiveness is pretty strong. But for a vaccine that is everywhere, so what you concern about age-related concern is actually the elderly sometimes have lower efficacy and response to due to various reasons. One being this concept of immune senescence, meaning that there are certain immune cells and components of the immune system that don't work as well. So that's one of the things that we are looking for in these trials, and a lot of elderly are included in the trials because this virus impacts older people disproportionately. Nobody is safe from this virus. Let me clarify, but it does impact disproportionately. And so one of the reasons why we are looking at this carefully is to look at age-specific effects of this vaccine.
Right, and there's a question to that, and I'm coming to that in a second. So just to remind everyone, we have a backstage with Dr. Saad as well. So do send in your interest and post that in the Q&A section, I think, and we'll bring you into the backstage, which starts at 7 o'clock. So Parvez Patel asks, and I'm picking it up only because it's an extension of what I asked, would the vaccine not adversely impact patients with comorbidities, given the fact that the virus is deemed dangerous to such patients?
That's a really good question. But we have found that even other viruses that disproportionately impact the groups that have comorbidities are actually not. The vaccine is safe and actually has a lot of net benefit for these people, because vaccines and natural infection, although employ some of the same immune pathways, but not exactly the same immune pathways. So that's the idea. For example, especially for an mRNA vaccine, it's not the live attenuated virus. Even live attenuated virus vaccines don't have the same disease. They don't have the disease potential. So that's the idea. That's the beauty of it, is that you are evoking the immune system without causing disease itself, even mild form of the disease. So that's how vaccines work. So right now, that is not one of the concerns, but again, that's why we do phase 3 trials. That's why we do it in a controlled fashion, so that we identify that. And so therefore, you don't get any surprises after the vaccine is licensed.
Right. So, a broader question, and I'm going to come back to some specific questions. Now, obviously, there is a race here, and the race is also driven by, in some cases, by companies who are listed on Wall Street and have already benefited from that spike. So, how do you find a balance or accept a balance between the race that we have to be in versus the risks that we are taking? And in some ways, who decides?
Look, that's traditionally the government's role, to decide that. But as you know, in the US, the dynamic is interesting because of an upcoming election. And in that so that's the traditional role of a regulatory agency, but not on its own. It's not to just, the regulatory agency is the final word. regulatory agencies rely on well-worn procedures that are out there. This is not the first vaccine we have licensed around the world, various drug control authorities like the federal, the Food and Drug Administration in the U.S., the European one, in countries like India, South Africa, etc. There was there was recent licensure of a new pneumococcal vaccine, for example. So entities, the regulatory agencies have their procedures. They're pretty standard procedures. You have a written protocol, pre-specified protocol in terms of what's done, not only what is done, but also when a trial will be stopped for, sometimes the trial is stopped early for good benefit, expected, etc., and so on and so forth. So those regulatory agencies relying on well-worn procedures, so even if there's government pressure, others can then see and comment on the veracity of the process.
But there is a pedal to the metal. I mean, everyone is moving fast, and I'm sure this is much faster than any or most other vaccine launches that we've ever seen in history. So, I mean, there is a shifting of goalposts, which is fine, I think, which is what most people would want. But equally, I'm just sort of highlighting what the concerns could be amongst most people.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I'll give you an example. There have been pushback in the US when things have been trying to accelerate it, and FDA has come out pretty clearly and vociferously that this is and they've set a meeting, for example, on October 22nd of their advisory committee where they expect the data to be presented, one way or another. When the Russians came out saying that they have a quote unquote approved or registered vaccine, there was substantial pushback. That vaccine is not being used globally. It's not being pre-approved by WHO. So when your important question, how do we find the balance? This is how we find the balance. There will be an instinct for certain entities to push forward, and then you have these checks and balances. I'll give you an example. In face of this call for transparency and using the same old procedure, even though doing it faster, but using the same process. If you're taking the highway and you're driving faster, is something else rather than going on a not as well-worn path, etc. So coming back to it, there was a story in the US that early next week, major pharmaceutical companies in the US will come out with a pledge that they will not make any decisions. So they will stop releasing data from press releases, or even if they release that, they will do it with full disclosure, using, for example, scientific article publication. They will commit to making all the decisions using mainstream process. That's a good sign. We should hold them to that. Right. So these are the checks and balances in the system.
Right. And Tushar Jani asked, what are the chances of getting emergency approval for the use of a vaccine? Or how do you get emergency approval, whereas others may not?
So that's a really good question. So it depends on the regulatory agency's paradigm, and actually depends on the legislation as well. And there are pre-specified rules. I think it is unlikely. So the full approval and the full licensure is not only dependent on sort of verifying the efficacy of the vaccine, but also all sorts of other steps like manufacturing, like all sorts of other things. So that kind of thing is not usually sped up in emergencies, because that's the old paradigm. That's the baseline solid paradigm. I see most of them, at least in the US, Europeans might do it slightly differently, even if it's well accepted by the scientific community, to have some form of emergency use authorization. But the question is how that is done is very important. Is it done based on the recommendations of the VRBPAC or the advisory committee for the Food and Drug Administration, and similarly in other places? Is it done based on data that are readily available and transparent? So that would matter. Because inherently the full licensure process takes time, and that would add another like 6 to 8 months to a year to the process, not just bureaucratic delay. It's there are specific steps needed for that. What I foresee is that initial one is likely to be, obviously it's not certain, things are evolving, is likely to be an emergency use authorization.
Right. So let me put that question differently. And Aman Rawat has done it for me. So he says there are various vaccine trials going on in various countries, but most of them fall into phase 2, phase 3, and some phase 1 as well. So my question is basically if these vaccines, will they work against the symptoms or whether they work against the virus? How long, and this is the underlying part, according to you, will it take to create a well-proofed or a foolproof vaccine and bring it to the common man?
So that's a really good question. So that's a slightly different question, but an equally important question. That phase 3 trials. So I'll give you an example of phase 3 trials. So there are two things that you're looking at: safety and efficacy. And efficacy is usually, these trials are now based on event-based sample sizes. So you say that you look at, you expect 150 infections to happen, for example, and these many people, if a vaccine is only is only 50% effective. That's the floor that has been specified. We all hope that it is more than that. WHO says that it should be ideally at least 70% effective, but that's the floor that most regulatory agencies are using. So based on that, you're saying you're recruiting a lot. You can either wait for a lot of people to get it, or you recruit a ton of people quickly. So that's the focus on that. So 30,000 people, 2/3 of them have been recruited, but then there will be a second dose will be administered to them, and then you have to wait for some people. Unfortunately, will get the vaccine in the infection and the disease in the unvaccinated group, and others will be protected in the double-blind trial where you don't know what you have given, in a sense that other than a small set of investigators. So that takes time, but also for safety follow-up, a couple of months are needed to see if early signals, because most of the safety events actually happen within the first couple of months, and so you.
Yeah, Dr. Saad, what's your sense? I mean, what could those symptoms be? I mean, today, let's say the vaccine is in our hands in a month's time, which it is supposed to be in some cases. And I mean, I think the chart that you've given about who do you administer it to in different phases is useful. So I'm assuming someone like me is not going to be in the first or the second phases. But if I do get it, I mean, what are the likely downsides, the likely upsides, or I mean, and the downside is that you don't even know whether it's working.
Yeah, no. So just come back to the previous question as well. The reason I was establishing that is to say that these steps would mean that it is unlikely to be available in a month's time for mass vaccination for mainstream products, no matter what the politicians say, etc. So we should, but a vaccine being available or being authorized either under emergency use or maybe under full licensure before the end of the year is not a fantasy. That's a clear possibility. The more likely scenario is really early 2021, but it is a possibility. It's a strong possibility the vaccine will be available in early 2021. In terms of the kinds of stuff you look out for, are certain things that there are certain conditions that, first of all, you go to the disease, what the disease causes. So you look at those kinds of syndromes. There are these solicited adverse events. So the reason why we do these trials is that people in these trials are followed up very intensively to say that they are exhibiting even early signs of that. Then there are certain autoimmune conditions like the Guillain-Barré syndrome. And then there are a few things is antibody-dependent enhancement. There's a phenomenon that you look out for. It's rare, but happens under certain diseases, etc. But there are two things. There is that you look for it in a trial, but once a trial is done, that's the reason why mainstream entities wait for a period of time before saying that it is safe and efficacious, is to assure. So if you're getting in a trial, that's a different situation. If you're getting it after approval, then you can do it with a peace of mind.
But I mean, I'm sure you're looking at the data far more closely than most other people, and what's happening in these trials. What's your sense?
In sense, in what's
I mean,
in terms of
where
what?
is this? I mean, is this vaccine looking like a reality? How close to reality? I mean,
Yes.
from whatever you've been looking at, and like I'm sure all the, whether it's those 48 vaccines or those 140 which are preclinical.
Yeah. So the signs are good. So first of all, immunologically, the principle has been established that you can evoke an immune response through vaccination. If it's effective, that's phase 3. The question is for phase 3. And in early phases, there is, early phase level safe evidence of safety. We should be ready for the first few vaccines to hurt a little, give a few people some fevers. The good news is that that doesn't correspond with long-term uh, side effects or major side effects. So what we are seeing is that a few people do get, after they get a shot, because but the other good news is, and this varies from vaccine to vaccine. The early trial data suggests that if you take paracetamol with that, it's actually reduced. Those symptoms are reduced. So these are immediate, what we call reactogenicity, which are events that do not have long-term sequelae, but hurt a little earlier on. So that's what it's looking. The other thing, the other really good sign that I keep on coming back to, is the fact that there are so many products, so many types of products, recombinant mRNA that have and vector-based and old school things like live attenuated vaccines that have shown promise. When you do that, so just like a stock portfolio that has a lot of stocks, you hedge your bets, you even out your risk. That's a really good sign.
Right. But you're saying as a patient, I'll have to take many vaccines, but I will
No,
only take one.
no, you'll take one. So what is happening is in the vaccine development program,
Right. Okay.
one of them is bound to succeed. The other thing is that we were initially, the vaccine programs were trying out single dose vaccines. They may come in the future, but the frontline products that are showing promise are likely to need 2 doses of the vaccine.
Right. And there were two questions on that. I think there was one from Tushar Jani, and Devendra Jogdio asks also, and related to that is, will these give lifelong immunity, or is it an annual administration?
It is unlikely to be annual, because what we know about coronaviruses themselves and some of these platforms, but we don't know if it would be lifelong. We'll have to see and study those vaccines to see if they provide lifelong protection. So that's a question. And these are the things that keep researchers myself employed for the long run. Because
Right. So Manvendra Gokhale asks about rollout times that you already talked about, but what side effects could emerge over a couple of years?
So we are on a most of the side effects, most of the severe side effects that we're concerned about, you identify in the trials. There may be rare side effects that we don't know, but they're so rare that the risk benefit is still in favor of benefit. So what I will say is that we will be on the lookout of things that resemble some autoimmune events, etc. We are on the lookout for some sequelae that look similar to the disease itself, but in a milder form. These are the things we look out for. But once the phase 3 is done, and it goes through proper usual procedures, people can be very confident, reasonably confident, that the risk-benefit ratio is heavily in favor of vaccination.
And this you're saying because not of what's happening in COVID, because of your experience and understanding of vaccines in the past.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
But those have been in decades in development.
Decades in development, a ton of experience, even with a new pathogen. So remember, this coronavirus is new. But we have known about coronaviruses for a while. We don't use commonly use a coronavirus vaccine, but we understand some of those things. And there's a reason why a lot of us anticipated a coronavirus outbreak. There was, movies about that as well. It is unfortunate. There are a lot of things that are unknown, but there are several things that are known about how things go out. And it's a game of probabilities. And the probabilities tell us that we are likely to catch any untoward events earlier on in the trials. We will be. There are systems being developed for post-marketing surveillance, by the way, that the US has stood up. The Europeans have done that. I'm working with the WHO group to prepare other countries to do that. That would be very, very essential to do an ongoing systematic monitoring of adverse events.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to come back to efficacy in the vaccine itself in a bit. Let's talk about distribution. So Vikas Dandekar asks, how objective do you think will be vaccine distribution, given that rich countries are buying up vaccines early on? Who will fulfill demand for developing countries?
That's a really good question. There are two aspects to it. So developing countries, low and middle income countries are not the low and middle income countries of 20 years ago. Indian manufacturers are the biggest suppliers in the world in terms of dose by dose basis. So that gives a lot of empowerment to several countries. And so the initial investments in production, etc. So that has changed the balance. But that doesn't mean that Zambia, even at good, healthy market rates, that makes sure that manufacturers also see benefit in developing. So this is, these are the market forces then that drive production. Do not necessarily have the ability for several countries to actually do that as well. So therefore, the COVAX facility, so which said that they will, for research and deployment, there will be $18 billion needed. And so this is a facility that is an entity that was developed through a collaboration of CEPI, as I said, Gavi, and WHO. And they asked for this, and most countries in the world expressed initial interest in this, and then they asked for solid commitments. It seems that, so the idea is it's a Robin Hood kind of a model that high-income countries pay still a good price, but not as low a price as low-income countries do. And so the money comes into the pool, and then that subsidizes low-income countries' vaccine access. And the gaps are filled through philanthropy and aid into that system, and it's a system that again hedges its bets on 9 products.
Right.
What has happened is that certain big players haven't put money into it. Europe has done it. US has put $0 into this, and that's concerning. About over 70 high-income countries have come in, so it's the prospects are reasonable but not perfect there. That would be the mechanism through this. So as a global community, we need to advocate and put pressure on governments and other entities to put money into this kind of a thing. That would make things equitable.
And is it your sense that most countries will follow the 4 stages of distribution that you talked about?
No, not every country will have a different priority scale, but broadly speaking, and so I'm working on the WHO side. I serve on the group that is deciding from, so just like the US side, that is because the global considerations are slightly different, etc. For example, there is an expectation within the US that 300 million doses for most of the population, or over 300 million doses, will be available within 12 months. That's not an expectation. Even in an equitable distribution scenario, that's not a realistic expectation of availability of vaccines for the full world. So there will be changes there. So the initial scenarios are that in the first year, we'll have vaccines available for 20%. But the good thing is that these 20% are, the good and unfortunate thing is that the burden of this disease is being borne by disproportionately by certain groups. So if you cover those groups, then you can open up the economy, etc. So each country will have a different one, but the focus would be protecting lives, protecting livelihoods by reducing transmission, and the balance of two. And the healthcare workers are likely to feature prominently in most countries' programs.
As they should. So there are a couple of questions on reinfections, and so let me bring that in. So Vikas Dandekar asks, and there's another person who's asked this as well. Some reinfections have been reported, a few through a different strain than the first one. Do you think a single vaccine will work, or do we need multiple vaccines targeting different strains?
At this, so there are 2 different questions. The one explicit and one implicit. So the reinfection question is that this is how immunity works, even after natural infection. Most people, if I get flu or if I get any other disease, most people would be protected after natural infection. HIV doesn't do that, etc. And the certain viruses that don't and bacteria that don't do that. But for most of them, there is protection, but some don't get it, a natural phenomenon. That's what we are seeing, that some cases are coming up, are being identified as true reinfections. So sometimes vaccines can do better than the nature. So there's no guarantee that the vaccines will have the same reinfection rate. They may have low reinfection, or that's what efficacy means. If 90% efficacy is that people 90% protected. 50% means that half of the people are likely to be protected. That's a simplified version of it, of translating efficacy. The other thing is the different vaccines for different strains. So far, the strains we have seen are not different enough for us to be majorly concerned about targeting each strain. But we'll watch and see. But right now, the concern and the way coronaviruses generally behave, that's not a major concern. To paraphrase Jay-Z, we have 99 problems in vaccinology. That's not one of them.
Okay, Homi Khushru asks, how does one create safeguards against teratogenetic risks in the abridged protocols for pandemics? So can you also, Dr. Saad, explain what that means?
So that means
that's me asking you, sorry, not him.
Yeah, no. So I think the implication is that if you vaccinate everyone, that includes pregnant women, how do you prevent any untoward effects to the fetus? We don't worry about teratogenic effects, for example, if you are sort of vaccinating other people, because it's not a chemical, it's an immune product, etc. So the idea for that would be to do trials in a controlled way in pregnant women, and we have learned a lot. A lot of the work I do is trials in pregnant women, etc. So what we have done is we have worked on tools to vaccinate pregnant women, that they will have to be early trials as they get covered. They're not sort of in the H1N1 pandemic. Pregnant women was the top priority group. In here, they are not, because the other groups more disproportionately vaccinated. And we will sort of look at that stuff in trials, and that would tell us. And then there's post-marketing surveillance. But there are certain things also depend on the type of vaccines. Live attenuated vaccines, we are more careful about giving to pregnant women for teratogenic effects. If it's an mRNA and other vaccines, the likelihood is very small for any effects to start with, or any teratogenic effects to start with. And one more thing, sorry, these companies are being urged to do lab-based reproductive toxicity studies. That will be the other data that will give us confidence to even start the trials in pregnant women.
And are pregnant women signing up for these trials?
Some are excluding them, some are not excluding them. Most of them are excluding pregnant women at this point, but they will have to be separate, one way or another. There will have to be separate trials for pregnant women fairly soon.
Okay, here's another question from a practitioner, I think. Ideally, during COVID-19 antibodies test for IgG, it's important before someone is vaccinated. Those who have IgG antibodies do not need vaccine, but the cost of IgG test is more than the indicated cost of vaccine in India. That's about $3 by the Serum Institute of India. If their vaccine is successful, how do we overcome this? Dr. Ishwar Gilada from Mumbai.
Yeah, so that's a good question. We haven't decided as sort of advisory committees, etc., that will be the case, that people who have IgG or IgG positives will be excluded, because we don't know. Just the positivity doesn't mean that they are protected. So we have this concept of that a lot of people may be aware of a correlate of protection, which means a certain type or certain level of antibody. We haven't identified it. We will identify it in the trials. So once we establish efficacy, often then we say, okay, what level of immune response was associated with actual protection against this virus? What type of immune response? Then we study that biomarker. So right now, and then we look at sort of safety aspect of vaccinating people with pre-existing antibodies versus not. Some trials are recruiting, will do this secondary analyses, etc. So the bottom line is, at this point, the first in line, it's unlikely that we will be restricting it only to IgG negative people, because we don't know whether with certainty that they're unprotected. That we do that for most vaccines as well. We don't test people for other vaccines because there's natural infection out there. Some people are undoubtedly have IgGs or against that, but we say the cost-benefit ratio is such that you go out and vaccinate everyone. And that's one reason for it.
And I mean, here's a question, and I'm going to append to that. Rakesh Tukral asks, claims and counterclaims on vaccine timing are confusing for common people. How should common people comprehend the vaccine news, as it's obviously a topic of interest? And there's another question about cure, and I'll come to that. And the question that I would append to that is, how do you how do you even know if the announcement that is being made is the right one? Number one. Number two, we know that a lot of people actually are wary of vaccines. There are anti-vaxxers, and I mean, it's a big movement, and I'm sure there's going to be another wave of anti-vaxxers when the vaccines start arriving. So how are you computing all of this?
Well, so there are a couple of things that I understand that in terms of there's a lot of noise in the system out there, and unfortunately, it hasn't been helped by people becoming overnight experts in vaccinology. So we initially said that people became experts overnight in herd immunity, for example, in epidemiology. That is happening with vaccines. So even well-meaning physicians who are who are very prominent in their own fields are now sort of delving into this kind of stuff. So my request is, please, I'm talking about experts on TV, etc., who are experts in other fields. This is very specialized understanding and knowledge. So one way for the general public to filter out signal from noise is to look at if someone has a history of doing vaccine work before January 2020, those are the people you should listen to. This is not amateur hour. This is the last inning of a test match where a new ball is introduced. It is not the new ball is the new coronavirus. The platforms, the technology has been being developed for the last for the previous 4.5 days. So focus on the expertise that is previously there, but not the expertise that is acquired overnight. There. So that's one thing. Anti-vaccine, etc. I'd be happy to answer a more detailed question, but broadly, the first step is to have a mainstream process. That's why scientists, etc., have been insisting on governments and regulatory authorities to speed up the process, but follow the mainstream process so that we can have. The reason why I go out and say vaccines are safe and effective is because I know the scientific data for that. So that's the first step. And then there are communications approaches that are being developed. I'm engaged with the process at WHO to communicate truly but effectively the benefit of vaccines in the context of overall risk, which is usually minor.
Right. And we are coming to the last few questions before we migrate to backstage. Priyakshi Das asks, if a person gets infected for the second time after getting cured from the first infection, would the effectiveness of the vaccine in such a person vary?
Don't know. And this is one of the things that I'm also studying amongst other people. So unfortunately, this is a new virus. This is a really good question. But there are things, as I said, that it's a test match. It's the last inning with a new ball. But there are some googlies that come in at the last, after lunch on last day as well. So these are the things we are watching out for. It's not going to upend the whole thing. But what may end up happening is that we will figure out, we'll tweak the recommendations based on emerging data. So this is not the type of thing that will say that the vaccine works or not. Overall, it would say that give these many doses to this many people, or sort of do this and that to the vaccine, or maybe comparison between different vaccine products.
Right. Dr. Zakaria Adam Hassan asked, is the adult vaccine, would it be, if I understood it right, will it be more efficient for those who have chronic diseases, or will there be several clinical trials to make sure they would not be facing severe side effects?
So there is, we'll have data. From other vaccines, we know that the adverse events are usually, even those who have chronic diseases in which vaccines are recommended, for example, influenza in certain countries are recommended for people with chronic diseases, they don't have disproportionate sort of adverse events in that. So that's less of my worry. We will continue. It will not need separate trials. They will be included in what we call post-marketing surveillance, and the statistical techniques that are being used for post-marketing surveillance are these rapid assessment statistical techniques, meaning that you get a result very quickly into that. So that would be the mode for evaluating that in people with chronic illness.
Right. So to come back to the strain, I mean, Miloni B asks, there are different strains of the disease everywhere. So will the vaccine be tailored per region or area? But also, could you correlate it to other vaccines? I mean, other vaccines that you worked with, is it a one size fits all globally?
So it depends on the vaccine. So vaccines like measles, like some of the other ones where we just take one vaccine for everyone. Vaccines like influenza are tailored by northern and southern hemisphere, at least, etc., and by season, and that depends on the mutation rate. So one way is that the geographic distribution in terms of space, but also in terms of time mutation rate. So far, what we have seen and what we know from other coronaviruses, uh, a global vaccine is likely to be the reasonable strategy. But as things emerge, that one thing can be rest assured that it will not go unnoticed if things emerge otherwise. So far, the data look encouraging for a single vaccine, single meaning that you could have different products, but not geographic strains in the vaccine.
Right. So there are questions from Karan Bhanushali, but I'm not going to take that, but I will mention it here. He says, how are you planning the last mile delivery of vaccines? He is developing an e-vehicle specialized for that. And it is a large part of the vaccine challenge is the distribution challenge. Last maybe question or two, Dr. Saad. So, there was a question somewhere which talked about, no vaccine has been found for AIDS and a lot of work has gone in. What's your sense about this one? And the other question, I think it's again from Miloni, which is the most fundamental question. Can the vaccine itself, in a way, take us to a path of normalcy, as in normal life as we knew it once upon a time? Or do we have to wait for a cure, which was another question, or a combination of all?
So the first thing is, what was your first question? Sorry, the second question was so interesting that I started thinking about that.
So let's go with the second one, which is or let's start with, so we said AIDS. We searched.
That's also a good question. The signs are so AIDS, because of the virus, impacts our own immune system, and the nature of the virus is such that it's the antigen targets for antibodies and sort of your immune system are in a way hidden, are not easily accessible, and there are other factors. HIV is exceedingly difficult to develop a vaccine against. This is not that kind of a virus. So initial data suggest that those signs are very encouraging. And even despite the reinfection news, what we have seen after natural infection is overall very encouraging. So that's one of the more important things. The last thing is, yes, there will have to be a combination, but vaccines are a major tool in getting life back to normal, and there will be a normal. There will be a new normal, and maybe the sort of the Western countries will adapt a version of their namaste for greeting, because shaking hands, people will be more averse to that. But other than that, there will be a normal. It will be a slightly different normal, but grandma will be able to attend weddings and so on and so forth.
Right. And I mean, you did mention a test match. So I don't know which innings we are in right now, but it's obviously we are still in maybe day one of a long test match, and surely not an IPL or a T20. All of which I'm sure everyone watching right now will understand. So the absolutely last question, Dr. Saad. So in your own sense, you do feel that the combination of a vaccine or a cure or behavior change, all of this will take us to some normalcy. So what is the time that you're instinctively and based on your understanding of all the work that's going on, what is this time frame?
Okay, so I cannot tell you in terms of calendar time, but I can tell you where from the start of a first licensed vaccine, because that starts a series of events. From the start of first authorized or licensed vaccine, we will have globally, especially if the COVAX facility gets the money it needs, within 12 months, we will have pretty substantial level of normalcy.
Right.
It wouldn't be perfect. And within 2-3 years total, we will be, again, it wouldn't be a thing of the past. The virus will remain with us, but it will be is likely to be a well-controlled virus if things go as we are hoping for them to go and the signs look good.
Right. Dr. Saad Omer, the director of the Yale Institute of Global Health, joining us from Connecticut. Thank you so much. It was great talking to you and hearing your views. Until then, it's thanks for me and goodbye for now.